Good afternoon. So I ran into some folks from the treasurer's office on the way here, and they said that you're all wound up. And I said, wait a sec, you're supposed to unwind them, not wind them up. But anyway, I just wanted to talk really briefly. I wanted to first apologize for not being here this morning, and I think I did get called to testify with Senator McGuire's committee to talk about taxes, which is probably like the least desirable thing any of us regulators want to go and talk about. So I didn't do anything with Senator McGuire. He's on his way. But I know our Chief of Communication, Alex Traverso, he does a great job with the Bureau. He's a great communication guy. And how many of you follow him on our Twitter and Facebook? He's you gotta see, he's pretty good with his comments. He's not like a regular regulator. But a couple of things I did want to mention. I know he talked about our regulations, and by the way, I want to thank all of you that had input in our regulation. We are going through them all. We really are reading them, and they've been very valuable to us. But I always want to keep it out there that we're continuing to develop new regulations because we have some new provisions under SB 94, and I think we're going to continue to need some input from you folks. And although it won't be part of the official rulemaking, always keep providing us with that input. Another thing, as Alex probably said, we're doing a lot of staffing, but I think what's going to be important for you folks is that we're actually hiring some folks that are going to be local liaisons. We're hiring people specifically to deal with the local jurisdiction. So we're hoping to have somebody on board next month, and of course it's going to take a little time to get them trained and that and whatnot. And so as soon as we have somebody that you can contact directly, we're going to let you know and provide that to CSAC and all of our partner local agencies, so you have that information, because I think it's so important that we're less than 6 months right now, so I think the pressure is on for all of us. So I think having that continued dialogue, that open communication, and you guys need somebody that you can contact directly and get the answers you need. We are working going through the trailer bill language right now we're still trying to figure out some things, and I think it's important that we continue to communicate what we're doing on our end, because what we come out with our final regulation really affects what you're doing at the local level, and obviously us interpreting what some of these laws mean. And especially when it comes to co-location, having the adult license, having the medical license, and so having those answers to you and communicating that is going to be really important going forward. With that, I just want to reiterate, everybody, we're still working on that. We're still doing our online licensing system, and we might have some end user testing coming up in the next few months, probably early fall. I'll be communicating with CSAC. If there's any of you that would want to be like a guinea pig, maybe do some testing, give us your feedback, because that is obviously one of the biggest things, is us being able to accept applications before the January 1st, 2018 deadline. So asked several times, one question we had today, and you guys, I don't know if you get this, but one of the senators said, what exactly are you guys doing? And I gave him a laundry list of things we're doing, but you guys have been dealing this, I always say this, you guys have been dealing with it for the last couple of decades. We're pretty new to this, so you get what we're dealing with. And you're right, the pressure is on, but I'm going to tell you we're still on track to make that deadline. I think having that temporary licensing authority in SB 94 is that's a big part of us being able to make our statutory deadline of issuing licenses on January 2nd, I believe, 2018. And just so you understand, those temporary licenses don't get issued unless they have local jurisdiction approval. So one of the things I said at the hearing today is constantly messaging our applicants that they need to go to the local jurisdiction, need to make sure that they're communicating with them, and then us continuing to have that dialogue. Anyway, I'm going to be here probably for like another hour. If anybody has any questions, I'll probably be off to the side. I'm happy to answer them offline. And thank you for allowing me to come and just briefly talk with you all, folks, and have a great rest of the conference. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for joining us here this afternoon. The idea here obviously is not only to give you folks something to think about, but also to answer some of the questions that you're going to have as this mega state of ours figures out the best path for legalizing recreational marijuana. California, for good or bad, is often pioneering. It does things first here, whether it's tailpipe emissions or other types of climate change legislation, tax reform. In this case, California has not taken the lead, at least when it comes to recreational marijuana, and so the advantage is that we can learn from perhaps the mistakes of others, but certainly we can talk about the opportunities as well as the pitfalls of legalized marijuana. As you know by now, 8 states across the United States have now legalized marijuana for recreational use, and over half of the country has legalized marijuana for some form of medical use. We, of course, know that here in California, having passed our adult use laws just this past year in 2016. And so today we have with us a couple of individuals from 2 states that took the plunge first, with legalization occurring in Colorado and in Washington State in 2012 for adults 21 and older. And so we're going to talk to them about lessons learned. Let me go ahead and give you a quick introduction of our 2 panelists, and then we'll let them offer some opening remarks. Eric Johnson is now in his 10th year as the Executive Director for the Washington State Association of Counties. Prior to joining the staff there, Eric served as a Lewis County, Washington Commissioner, first elected in 2000 and again re-elected in 2004. As a county commissioner, Eric primarily focused on transportation and public works, land use and natural resources, and improving health and human services in distressed rural communities. He's worked in administrative positions for the cities of Chehalis and Bellingham and served for 11 years as the Assistant Director for the then Washington State Interagency Committee for Outdoor Recreation. Eric is passionate about effective and efficient delivery of public services. He works tirelessly to improve public policy and processes, strategic organizational improvement, and ensuring prioritization and accountability for public expenditures. Our other panelist, Andrew Freedman, colloquially known as Colorado's marijuana czar. I'm not sure if that's on the business card or not. But Andrew was appointed the state's first director of marijuana coordination by the governor. He ensured the efficient and effective regulation of Colorado's retail and medical marijuana sales while promoting public health, maintaining public safety, and keeping marijuana out of the hands of children. He managed hundreds of millions of dollars in marijuana tax revenue and guided the administration through difficult regulatory, legal, and personnel issues as Colorado became the first state in the world to regulate recreational marijuana. He led the administration through difficult challenges, unique regulatory structures, the gray and the black market, the lack of banking, pesticide regulations, tax work, public education campaigns, edibles regulation, hemp regulation, and countless other topics. Complicated issue. He's been featured by 60 Minutes, NBC Nightly News, The Today Show, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, The Boston Globe, and dozens of other national and international news outlets. So, Eric and Andrew, thanks to both of you for being here this afternoon. Let me go ahead and start, Eric, with you. If you want to go ahead and grab the mic and offer some kind of framing comments.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's good to be here. I think this is on. I'm Eric Johnson. I'm with the Washington State Association of Counties. I think Kevin indicated that you were not first in recreational marijuana. I think what he meant to say, you were not first in legal recreational marijuana, I think.
Well said.
So I think we have all learned a lot from California about recreational marijuana. So it is great to be here with you all. If you're an elected official, I really want to thank you for your service. If you're an appointed official, a staff member who really does the work, good luck. This is a very, very challenging issue. So in Washington State, Initiative 502 passed our voters 56 to 44% in 2012. It was a big turnout. It was 81% voter turnout, so it was a very big year as well. So it was a vast majority of our citizens. And July 2014 was the first legal recreational pot shops that were open. And July of 2016, we integrated our medical system. Our medical system, similar to, I think, Colorado, was kind of the wild, wild, uncontrolled West in the medical system. So we now have more of an integrated system. I'm not going to proclaim I'm an expert. I have a lot of knowledge of how counties have dealt with this, both in Colorado, in Washington, how Oregon's going through it, how Alaska's going through it, and spent some time dealing with that. I think my best advice to you is to gain tremendous insight into what your role is. Be very crystal clear of the role of county government, your role, and knowing that a number of you will have political responsibilities to your community beyond what your legal responsibilities or statutory responsibilities are. I oftentimes get asked, is it better or worse? Was all the hyperbole about what was good or bad about what was going to happen with legalizing marijuana happening? And let me just give you a couple of numbers to kind of stimulate the discussion and thinking. Since 2006 to 2016, we do annual studies of grades 6, 8, 10, and 12. And there has been no measurable or unchanged use in those ages. And that's pretty typical across the nation as well, those states that have legalized. So some of these numbers are from a report that our Office of Financial Management published. 14%, that is actually the annual yearly increase in adult age consumption since legalization from some of the surveys and studies. So we actually are seeing adult use actually going up. 21%, that's the percentage of 18 to 24-year-olds that are actually now utilizing marijuana recreationally. 73%, that is the increase in poison control calls since legalization of marijuana, which I think with edibles and potential menu labeling issues is going to be an issue that we do have to pay some attention to. 2.7%, this was an interesting study out of the Highway Loss Data Institute, that insurance claims in the 3 states that legalized since legalization, 2.7% is the increase in number of claims that have gone up. Collision rates have gone up in Colorado, Washington, and Oregon since legalization. An interesting statistic in a AAA study, and there's a lot of factors that go into this for sure. But fatal crash data, prior to legalization, 8.3% of drivers had THC in their system prior to legalization, 17% after legalization. So there's different issues. That doesn't mean they were consuming at the time, but the THC was present. A lot of different issues associated with that. 49 million. That is the number of people in the, we'll give credit to Alaska as an adjoining state, 5 adjoining states here in the West that have passed recreational marijuana. It's 49 million people and 15% of the United States population that now live in those types of states. Let me give you 2 other numbers. One, that is North Bonneville. It is a city of North Bonneville in Washington State that owns its own pot shop and got a license from the state. And my favorite is this that came out in April 28th of this year in the Tacoma News Tribune. Which counties have more pot shops than Starbucks? In Washington State, the answer is 18 of 39 counties have more legal marijuana stores than Starbucks. So there's your indicator of popularity. So with all that said, there's an interesting article in September of last year that the Cato Institute produced a report that looked at all of the post and pre projections of what was going to happen with legal marijuana, legalization of recreational marijuana. It was called, the article was called A Dose of Reality Effects of State Marijuana Legalization, and it found this. Our conclusion is that state marijuana legalization has had minimal effect on marijuana use and related outcomes, with one exception, and that was state tax revenue. And in Washington State, that is no exception. I am delighted to hear that California has local authorities for revenue. We do not have local authorities in Washington State, and that is a big problem. It is a significant problem. Our state has a 37% retail excise tax now. Originally, when it was passed, it was 25% at retail, 25% at production, and 25% at processing. They eliminated that, rolled that into a 37% excise tax. The current biennium, which just ended, the state collected $469 million. Keep in mind our biennial budget in Washington State, just the biennial operating budget is about about $43 billion. The current biennium we're going into, the projection is $685 million. In 2019-2020, the projection is $739 million. So it is on an increase. The state will be sharing less than 2% of that revenue with local government, cities and counties. So we have attempted to get that changed on several occasions, unsuccessfully, I might add. The major issue that our local county officials have had is what I call, first was to ban or not to ban. Our Attorney General gave the opinion that the actual citizen initiative passed it was silent on the authority of local government associated with ban. The AG came back and said it's an inherent right of local government to zone, therefore banning or not to ban was authority. We've had 5 of our 39 counties that have banned all types of recreational marijuana from processing, production to retail. 76 of our 281 cities have banned. So land use is a big issue. After that decision to ban, the decision was zoning, is what to do with it from both a processing, production, and retail perspective. We had some counties that actually took the passive approach. The state law actually stipulated certain elements of what could be done and where it could be done at. Setbacks, 1,000-foot setbacks, for example, from parks or playgrounds or child care facilities. So we had some jurisdictions that just said, you know, if it's existing and can be done, it can be done. Other jurisdictions have gone through the very painstaking process of going through significant zoning processes to determine where these activities can go from retail, processing, production. Zoning districts, the setbacks requirements, are they requiring variances? Is there an appeals process? Is there a conditional use permit? Is there fencing? Is there security? Is there lighting? All of the types of things that are necessary when you're citing these. And a number of our jurisdictions have come back and put moratoriums on after they did their original zoning because it didn't work. They ended up with some unintended consequences. Our urban counties in particular ended up with some challenges that they did not like because they ended up with these pockets of unincorporated area around the cities where all of these retailers came and located. We have 2 pockets in minority and poverty-stricken areas that have now become the kind of the retail centers, and where you might have 12 legal recreational marijuana stores in a population that might be serving about 35,000 people. They become the hub. So there has been some social justice issues that I think we've seen in some of our urban counties as well. I think the last comment, and I was delighted to hear Lori Ajax talk about this, we have not had a great relationship with our state because our state has at time ignored and issued permits in zone areas where they are not permitted. And we've had 2 of our counties that have had to go through then zoning compliance issues, had to go through, clear through abatement of businesses because they placed themselves in an area that was not appropriately zoned. And we've seen our state Cannabis and Liquor Control Board not give enough credence to the zoning and look at those licenses in relationship to where they're going to be placed and whether the state can do that. So I'm going to stop there and look forward to the questions.
Thank you. I thought for a moment there you were going to suggest that the Starbucks drive-thrus up there were offering special goodies in addition to the lattes. Maybe that's coming. Yeah. All right, Andrew, you're up.
Great. So I'm Andrew Freedman. I was Colorado's marijuana czar for the last 3 years, although it feels like a lifetime. Before that, I was Lieutenant Governor's Chief of Staff. I like to tell everybody that. My mom was really proud of me when I was Lieutenant Governor's Chief of Staff. Would tell everybody that I was Lieutenant Governor's Chief of Staff. And then I became the world's first marijuana czar, and she told everybody that I was the Lieutenant Governor's Chief of Staff. So, and then now, and I was a lawyer, and I watched all my friends work really hard to become partners at their different firms, and I just had to pay $50 in order to register with the Secretary of State, and I'm a named partner at my own firm now, Freedman and Koski, and our job is to go state to state and work with governments and ancillary businesses such as banks to figure out how to get through implementation of recreational and medical marijuana. So it's a real pleasure to be here today. I will say, and this is not blowing smoke, and I really didn't mean that pun either, that when we were first having these types of conversations in Colorado, it was mainly as a proxy for kind of relitigating the legalization debate. That it had been a highly divisive issue, and most of the speeches that you would have seen today would have been some form of standing on the side of the debate. And so I'm actually very impressed and have a lot of hope for you guys that you're not dealing with those stages of denial and you're actually more engaged in how best to serve your counties than you are in whether or not this was the right decision for California. I think that will fast-track you through a lot of issues that we were not able to get to as fast in Colorado while we were still working our way through those issues. So I thought I would just use this time to talk about 5 important areas that we saw from the state level that counties and cities really needed to help the state deal with, and also needed to communicate with each other in ways to deal with that, in hopes that it will give you some amount of a roadmap going forward of what you might see and how you might communicate right now in order to tackle it. The first, and this was touched on before, but the first is how to prevent kind of economic micro bubbles when this huge industry comes on overnight. And I'll tell the story of Alary Swansea in Denver. Alary Swansea is a mixed-use neighborhood in the north of Denver, primarily Hispanic. Denver and Boulder, so Colorado's system was dual licensure. It was written right into the Constitution that you needed both a city or county license as well as a state license, and that the city or county had to opt in to a system in order to have it. Well, the first 2 cities and counties to opt in were Denver and Boulder, and because they were the most liberal and because they had the resources to do so. So what ended up happening is industry people who wanted to be first into market ended up putting agricultural grows in the middle of Denver, specifically in Alary Swansea. That, in a lot of economic ways, makes no sense. There's no other agricultural product that's being grown right in the middle of Denver. You have to pay more for real estate. You also have to have it inside a warehouse space, and that means you have to have lighting. Really, if you looked at it from a purely economical and not any sort of political decision, a place like Pueblo makes a lot more sense. For Colorado, it's rural space, it's open, it has access to water, transportation, electricity. Having a greenhouse in Pueblo makes a lot more sense economically than having a warehouse in Denver. But Pueblo took a couple more years to come on. So Alary Swansea, during a time where the stock show had moved there and they could have had pretty solid economic growth, is filled with marijuana warehouses that are slowly but surely now moving to Pueblo as Pueblo came on later. And that's meaning that there are giant warehouses that are hard to remediate in the middle of Alary Swansea that are, I think, going to slightly, moderately devastate the neighborhood even more than it's already devastated. And so I would say that is a conversation to be having with each other right now, which is if you start to see something that economically does not make sense in your county, such as many warehouse grows, that means something political is happening in the short term that is not going to last in the long term, and you should be talking to your county neighbors about how to kind of jump through that bubble before you start creating infrastructure that doesn't make sense there. The second to talk about is unlicensed grows / home grows. By far, this is the biggest Achilles heel in the Colorado market right now. We created quite a few ways that you could grow outside of the licensed market that Lori Ajax and their department is creating. You could grow at home fairly easily between the medical and recreational system up to 99 plants. And here's the big economic here's the hardest stress on the system. Marijuana goes for a considerable amount of money in Colorado. It goes for 4 times that amount of money once it crosses the state border. Same is true in California. So what you'll end up seeing is at any place where there's a weakness in the system, such as an ability to grow outside a licensed system and ship marijuana out of state, whether it's medical or recreational, someone's going to abuse that system. And so you should be keeping a very close eye on what loopholes are approaching. If you're a county with a loophole, not even that your laws have a loophole, but maybe you have not put anything specifically towards enforcement of that area, people will move into your county in order to abuse that system. So we again, in Pueblo, we found a lot of people that had just gone and gotten 99 plant count, patient plant count, and we're growing in other people. We're renting out, we're renting into houses and growing large amounts of plants. And it was actually organized crime. We found a Laotian crime unit, a Chinese crime unit, Floridians of Cuban descent crime unit. And this really is, I think, the point where organized crime has come in to our system has been almost entirely on the home grow side. I would say that creates that's a lot of tension on public safety. And so that's a conversation that you need to make sure you're continually having with each other, your chiefs of police, your sheriffs, and the state in order to ensure that you have not let those sort of weaknesses into the system. Third one I wanted to mention is pesticides. Pesticides ended up to be really difficult, both on a state level and on a local level. But it hit the locals first, and that's because, so on our side, we knew it was a problem. We were trying to work through it, and for those that don't know why this is a specific problem for marijuana, normally pesticide, both standards and enforcement, are left to the EPA and FDA for 99% of this stuff. They're not going to help. And in particular, California just tried to get a pesticide registered through an EPA process we thought was open to us, and the EPA said that's not open. So it is incredibly difficult and has to kind of be in-house inside California what sort of pesticides should be allowed to be used, but also who's going to enforce that pesticide use. In Colorado, that took quite a while to get up and running on the state side. We were working as fast as we could, but it simply was very complicated. And what ended up happening is in Denver, they were sending fire patrol in, they were sending in local public health, and everybody was noticing that there were chemicals that were not supposed to be inside that were inside, and they realized they were putting their own people at danger. Meanwhile, they were hearing from workers who were getting sick off of illegal pesticide usage. And since you guys are so much closer to what's going on than the state, Denver felt like they just had to act. And so they started pesticide regulation before the state of Colorado truly started pesticide regulation. That's difficult for a number of reasons. One, industry went apoplectic and started to come out against Denver up until the point where the state of Colorado said, we're doing the exact same thing Denver's going to do. They tried to play us off each other. We also saw industry just move to different counties where pesticide regulations were not happening as stringently. And so, again, it's going to be a place where everybody needs to speak from the same playbook. What sort of pesticides are you going to allow, herbicides, fungicides, inside your facilities? And it's going to be a conversation you have to have with fire, with public health, and with workers' associations, because this will show up in your newspapers. Your local newspaper will pick up some marijuana from a shop and go get it tested in a lab and find out what marijuana is being used on it. It will be a hot button issue, and kind of the sooner you get on the same page, the more you can head that off at the pass. Banking was touched on, and I will say quickly, the banking talk I just came from with Courtney and Tim was singularly the best presentation I've seen on it. And that's a little bit of a backhanded compliment because Tim is in charge of putting together other presentations on it. But what I'll say is that it was so clearly put forward why this is a problem and a path forward. There was a comment in it is we're expecting a solution to come out of the Treasurer's office on this, and I thought there was realistic expectations set on that. There's not going to be an immediate solution on it because this is going to take a lot of data rigor, and it's going to take a lot of working together to start to find community banks and credit unions that will start to help you guys. And so the actual solution to banking will be a communication between all of you, and I was delighted to hear that CSAC is actually heading this up, because I think that's a perfect solution. That all of you will need to talk about your data needs, what you're going to be collecting, what your banks need in order to feel good about banking marijuana and having the appropriate data, and what the state can provide to make sure that the data is clean and is coming in a timely manner. That conversation is singularly the most important conversation for ensuring that your community banks and your credit unions can start taking this on. The better you are at educating everyone in the situation, about what data systems matter here, I think the faster you'll see a solution, including your credit unions and your community banks. Their boards will have to know what's available to them as far as data streams go, in order for them to start creating the sort of compliance measures they need going forward. I will mention really briefly, because I think it's important, that the three things that Courtney put forward as the most important solutions to banking in the short and long run. The first is federal legislation. The second is clear, transparent licensing. And the third is information shared with financial institutions. I believe those are all correct, and I believe that this group right here has more power to get to leverage every one of those things, including finding a voice to talk to federal Congress about, than anybody out there. And so the more you take that on, and the quicker you take it on, the better off banking will be for America, really. And finally, I'll talk about edibles and DUIDs real quick. It's strange to put them in the same place, but we saw also an increase in hospitalization rates, as well as an increase in drivers in fatal accidents testing positive for marijuana. I will say there's a lot of unforeseen consequences that come up when you do something that's new in America. And one of the things I think we wish we had had was some more immediate communications from our counties on what the problems they were seeing on the ground. For edibles, it ended up to be that naive users, people who had not used marijuana in a long time, were using edibles, and it was always the same experience. They'd have one, they'd think it didn't work, they'd have another, they think they're the first person immune to marijuana, they'd start to drink, and then 4 hours later, because they can take up to 4 hours to feel the effects of marijuana, they'd feel it all, and they'd show up in the emergency room. They're actually, it is a miniature psychotic break. You'll be fine, but you're a danger. I know that doesn't sound like that, but you'll be a danger to yourself and to those around you. We've seen those numbers start to come down with public education pretty dramatically. The Poison Control Center calls are starting to come down. What would have been much better, I think, is if our Breckenridges would have said, hey, listen, we are seeing something now. On day 5 of this, it's very clear that our tourists are overdosing on edibles. And so there should be point of sale education, and there should be a public education campaign. The more quickly you help the state identify where the public education campaigns are needed, the more quickly I think we'll go through our growing pains here. So with that, those are the 5 areas that I would have looked into. I'm sure there'll be 30 more by the time you guys get into this, and obviously you guys are the real experiment here, but I hope that's helpful as you start to look through into it.
We want to avoid temporary psychotic breaks at all costs. Thank you both for framing the experience that your 2 counties have had with legalization. Let me start by asking, in California, we have what I would describe as a very gradual evolution of marijuana legalization. We had our first medical marijuana law passed in '96, Proposition 215, and that was then followed by years and years of passive regulation until finally the legislature passed comprehensive legislation to regulate medical marijuana, and that then seemed to set the foundation for legalization of recreational marijuana. How does that path, in other words, focusing on medical marijuana versus other forms of use, how did that differ from the paths in both Washington and Colorado?
So in Colorado, the brief history is we passed medical in 2000, and it was mainly an unregulated caregiver system. You go to your doctor, you get a recommendation, you grow up to 6 plants. You grow 6 plants to whatever is medically necessary, and that was not defined. And you can either grow that yourself or give it to a caregiver. In 2010, when the Ogden memo came out, we saw medical marijuana go from 20,000 patients to 100,000 patients basically overnight. And both the city of Denver and the state of Colorado realized they had to regulate for-profit medical marijuana because it was just happening. That ended up to be a great thing because we ended up putting in, of other things, seed-to-sale tracking inside of the medical marijuana system, and then we could lay our recreational system on top of that medical system. We got some of our growing pains on the medical side before having to go over to the recreational side, and that saved us quite a bit of heartbreak. I will say that evolution of different ways of allowing for home growing until we allowed for full-scale commercialized recreational did create a lot of home grow situations that are still being abused today. And so you have to go back and look at the entire system and see how would a criminal abuse this system, and go up and clean up everything at the same time. And if you don't, you'll just watch the weakest parts of your system overcome the strongest parts of your system. It's unfortunate, but it all has to happen at the same time.
Eric?
So in Washington State, as I indicated, we really did consider the medical side the wild, wild west. It was unregulated, and dispensaries were unregulated. Location of dispensaries were unregulated. How they received their product was unregulated. So recreational came in, and recreational was in fact was being regulated and through the legalization process, and yet folks knew that about 85% of the users in the medical system that had got their medical card were really probably using it for a recreational purpose. It was not a medical purpose, and so the state, yeah, I know, shocking. I know, there's a shock. I know, especially in California, that is a shock. So all of a sudden, you had this recreational side that if we didn't correct the fact that the vast majority of folks that were going to still use the Wild Wild West system in these dispensaries, the medical dispensaries, you had to correct that, and you had to harmonize that. And that was a very difficult thing for the legitimate medical user to realize that you were now going to have to go to a licensed store that does not have to pay. If you have your medical card, you don't have to pay the excise tax, and so you get the break on the excise tax. But there probably is an additional, a higher cost within the regulated system than the previous system. So it was a real struggle for the medical side than certainly the recreation side.
Well, you're both by now familiar with this fundamental conflict between federal law and state law. And as everybody knows, cannabis is still scheduled still classified as a Schedule I drug under the Controlled Substances Act, which by federal law makes it illegal to cultivate, manufacture, distribute, or to dispense. So again, an interesting conflict between states' rights and federal law. How did your states deal, at least initially, with pushback from the federal government? I know that a big part of their concern is making sure that marijuana is kept out of the hands of children.
Well, so I think the big thing we did in the regulatory system, which I do think has, at least during the Obama administration, did put them at ease more, was implement the seed to sale tracking system that had the sort of granularity that a radio frequency identifier tag on every plant. And so there was at least some accountability in the system that it was both not going out of state and that you could do stings on licensees and know if it's going to children or not. And I think that did provide them some assurance. I will say, the places where it still comes up and was talked about today are really banking and professional services. And so if your job, which we saw our job as, is to create a highly regulated industry, you want to be able to rely on the same tools that everybody has for our highly regulated industry, and that's access to professional services and strict financial oversight. Those, for the most part, did not exist in the opening years. Now that they've, as people have seen market opportunities, we've started to see accountants and lawyers and banks come in Colorado. But it is the equivalent of trying to set up a regulatory system with one arm tied behind your back. And so I will say that's the biggest place it came up over and over again, is the sort of legitimate ancillary businesses that we wanted help from were not willing to help in this area.
I think another element of the federal issue for our state and a number for our growers in particular and processors more than retailers is the inconsistency of how the feds have, the different federal agencies have treated marijuana. So for example, we have the Columbia Basin Federal Irrigation Project, and the feds have indicated that no federal water can go to outdoor grows or to grows. And so you got DOJ at one point saying, keep it out of the hand. We're going to somewhat say, we're going to turn our head to a certain point. And then you got others saying, no. We had I think it was in San Juan County, an island county. The only way you can get your product off of the island is to either take a ferry, which is licensed by the U.S. Coast Guard, or fly it, and you deal with the FAA, both of which would be a violation of federal law and have been told you're not taking that product off of the island. And so, I mean, that has been, I think, one of our greatest, our bigger problems is just the inconsistent approach that the federal government has treated marijuana in our state as well. And so I'd say that would be the other one. The last thing I would say on that really is I think our current Attorney General, Bob Ferguson, who took on the Trump administration over immigration, would love to see the Trump administration do something on marijuana, because I think he would love to fight the Trump administration again.
I'll say also really quickly, and this point has been brought up, expect, the best you're going to be able to expect is forgiveness. You'll never get permission. And so just operate under that mindset. If you are waiting for the federal government to tell you you're allowed to do something, it is not going to happen. Not in pesticides, not in banking, not on any part of this. And so you're basically hanging your hat on inaction. And so the longer you've seen inaction, kind of the better off you are.
Did either of your states face any kind of pushback, at least initially, from U.S. attorneys in your jurisdiction? Was there any talk about, look, there's no way that we're going to stop enforcing federal law despite what the state has done?
I would say more so during the times with medical marijuana. There were some fits and starts there about what that meant, but for the most part, no.
No, neither our Eastern Washington or Western Washington federal district attorneys did.
In terms of law enforcement, Andrew, you mentioned that the illegal grows have really posed a serious challenge on this, and that it has led to proliferation of cartel-type activity. How worried should local jurisdictions, sheriff's departments, police departments be about that?
So I would say it would be their top priority of issues to look into. And really it should center around everyone who's outside the license system. Is it very clear what they're allowed to do? Because if your law enforcement feels like they can't easily train their officers to be able to know what is an illegal grow and what is a legal grow, they'll throw up their hands very quickly, along with your DAs. Do your DAs feel like they could get pretty simple convictions off what they would see? If they can't, then they'll stop. And second, the criminal element is unfortunately really smart about this right now, and they have well-trained lawyers on staff in the criminal element looking at the jurisdictions in America that are the easiest to do it. I know that's true because I kept saying, oh my God, there's a loophole there. And within a week, you would see that somebody was abusing that loophole. And so some people are nuanced about what's going on. And so I would make sure that, that your county feels very secure about both the zoning regulations and the state law have created a good system for preventing that sort of activity.
Anything to add?
I would just say, we actually, the home grows, we ended up with collaboratives, and the collaboratives were much smaller in nature. I think you can have 4 patients growing up to 15 plants apiece, I think. And so our collaboratives are much more delineated and much smaller for the collaborative.
One other quick law enforcement question before we move on, and that is, what about dealing with speed enforcement, traffic enforcement? What kind of a challenge has that created for law enforcement patrolling your highways in terms of trying to determine who's driving under the influence and who's not?
So we call them DUIDs for driving while high. The science, the biggest problem is that science really has not caught up with what it means to be driving while high. Both the blood test we take, and we have a presumptive 5 nanogram THC limit. I believe you guys have a per se limit. So if you're over that limit in California, you can get a DUID. In Colorado, you also have to fail a roadside sobriety test. I will tell you, I get mixed stories from law enforcement. Some people say, hey, we're seeing a lot more of it, and other people just say, no, we're getting better at recognizing it. And so that's what's showing up in the data. I will tell you, it's very noisy data so far, because what we essentially did was write a new law the exact same time that we legalized recreational marijuana, and then we put it about $6 million for training our officers to be able to spot it. And so when you make it a clearer law and then you pay for enforcement, you basically have thrown out all your baseline data of what it was like before legalization. The most concerning statistics that we're seeing are the fatality related. The drivers in a fatal accident are still showing up with THC in their system. Again, I just think it's going to take longer and more science and more public education campaigns to be able to figure that out.
Yes, I think, in fact, I wish I would have, could pull it up, but I think we just had in Washington State, I think it was State Patrol pulled over someone that had a 54 times the legal limit in their bloodstream when they just had a blood test DUI, I think it was, and I just saw that headline. So there's clearly some challenges out there. Drug recognition, we're having to spend a lot more money on officer training than we perhaps had to do, because drug recognition training is much more needed, because you just can't blow like you could on DUI. So we're spending a little bit more resources on that. Our state is allocating money to both the University of Washington, Washington State University, to try and find a type of breathalyzer that can be utilized in the field. And so I don't know if California will be joining that and providing some money to academia to help find some of those solutions. I think the other thing that we have found in the drug, one of the comments that we heard going through this is that there'll be less burden on law enforcement. Well, we certainly don't have the possession issues that we have to track that we did before. And people said, well, there'll be fewer grows. I've never seen to this date, and clearly it's early, the sheriffs have every bit as much to do than they did before. So in our state, so I don't know if there's really a diminishment in law enforcement responsibilities at all.
Both of you talked earlier about the banking issue and the breakout discussion you had this morning, but let me ask again. The federal government, as we know, does play a central role in regulating financial institutions, and therefore plays a role in whether or not cannabis businesses have access to banking and financial services. What has been the most effective way, would you say, that your individual states have dealt with cash management in this regard?
So I'm not sure we've done anything on the cash management side that has, first of all, the businesses are rather good at it. I mean, they have high incentives to be good at it. And the last time I looked, actually, I was actually shocked by how little violent crime we saw around the cash nature of this. And so the last time we took a look, there was something around. So it is a more heavily burglarized industry than a normal industry, but it was 1/7 the amount of convenience stores at the last time we took a look at it. And when I came on the first day, I thought people were going to be killed on a daily basis because of how much cash was on the street. But they do they do a good job of making sure that the available loose cash is actually pretty low on a day-to-day basis. I think the bigger problem with banking and not having access to banking is much more around money laundering and the criminal element that has decided to come in because this is such a heavily cashed industry. So surprisingly, I think people are using marijuana businesses to launder other forms of illicit activity, and that's where the real problem is.
Yeah, I think cash has been an interesting issue. It's a cash from a customer to the bank or to the customer to the actual retail outlet. At this point, seems to be one of the bigger challenges. We have been successful. Our executive director of the State Department of Financial Institutions actually went to a couple of banks. They went to I think Salal Bank in Seattle, which was a state chartered bank, and Numerica in Spokane, I think it was. They both combined have several hundred to 1,000 customers now from the marijuana industry. In fact, Salal, I think the last kind of fact that I heard is about 85% of their net worth is now in marijuana industry. So they really have taken that portion on. So it seems like we've got a solution that is working. Is it perfect? I don't know, but it seems to be certainly seems to be working to a certain degree.
How would you characterize how the financial institutions themselves have stepped up and worked cooperatively?
So the tier ones have stayed out altogether, and I think every once in a while, I'll get somebody that tells me that they have a tier one on the hook and something awesome is about to happen, and every time it doesn't happen. And what we've watched more is that a few community banks. So, and the other thing that we tried we took care of a lot of the Hail Marys for you guys. We tried a state chartered credit union. We tried to create something called a co-op. we've looked all into the cryptocurrency. So thankfully, we took care of some of the hard work for you guys on those things.
We appreciate that.
So what really ended up working is a few community banks and credit unions really holding hands on this one and deciding that they were going to both bank it, but they also were going to create compliance systems that, while fairly expensive, really were doing as good of a job as regulators were looking after what was happening inside the industry, and really kind of pushing the boundaries of seeing what federal regulators, or state regulators for that matter, would do about that. And to date, we have not had an action. The DEA has not come in and raided one of these places. The worst we see is that some of the financial institutions who shouldn't be doing this are being told to stop doing it. And they shouldn't be doing it because they haven't put down the due diligence in order to do it. And so I am optimistic that if those same community banks and credit unions find each other in California and the data is made available to them, that they'll find a way to find at least a short-term remedy for the banking problem.
And I think last statistic I saw, I think we have 12 financial institutions in Washington State that are providing banking services. The vast majority is being provided by those two that I indicated, Solel and Numerica. The state, the last report I saw from the state is about 95% of the excise tax is paid in some means other than cash. So it is not, cash rolling into the liquor or to the Department of Revenue to pay the cash. So the vast majority is finding a way outside of cash.
All right, tax revenues. A lot of legislators across the street at the Capitol have a sort of a glint in their eye when they think about all the tax revenues that are going to come flowing into the state treasury and help pay for certain programs or backfill certain expenses. Realistically, has it been a disappointment? Has it been on projection as far as what your two states have seen?
So I'm a pretty big wet blanket when it comes to tax revenue, mainly because so there's no other tax stream in Colorado, at least, that every month when the tax revenue numbers come out, it makes like the front page of the Denver Post. And so that the perception of how much tax revenue this is versus the reality is way off in Colorado, and it will be way off in California because I see the amount of salivating. So we will make somewhere between $200 to $250 million in tax revenue this fiscal year out of a $27 billion budget. And so it's always very important to keep that in mind. We put 40 to 60 million back into all sorts of public safety and regulatory side, and we put somewhere between 40 to 60 million into school construction, and the rest goes to discretionary funds. So I like to talk about the 40 million into school construction. The fund that got that it's called the BEST Fund in Colorado, got $2.8 billion worth of requests for school construction, and that's just the requests that qualified. And so we could fund 1/70th of the requests that come in. For the 69/70ths that did not get it, they all wondered where the tax revenue was going, and so it became harder for them. They said to pass mill levies because everybody thought the marijuana money could handle it. I will just say I really want to get out the message that if you're expecting to handle billion-dollar issues in Colorado, trillion-dollar issues in California with sin taxes, you're not going to get there. And so it's not that it's bad money. We put $16 million a year into homelessness that is really highly leveraged money that otherwise would not get that money. And so that's great money to have in the system. It's just please don't expect to change the face of education, transportation, healthcare, because you won't get there with marijuana tax revenue.
In Washington State, as I indicated, it'll be about 700 million, a little more than 700 million or about 700 million this biennium. So $350 million annually. That's new revenue. It's new revenue that the state did not have, just 4 years ago. So it's for us, it's nothing to sneeze at. That's out of a $43 billion state annual budget. So 700 million is a significant chunk of revenue. I think our frustration, as you heard me in later, is that the states. I'm going back to years and years ago in my memory. We joked about the state is it bogarting that revenue. If you don't know what that is, you never bogarted. So look it up. And this, states keeping it to themselves and not sharing that. And we know the significant impacts that are happening, particularly with local law enforcement and code compliance and the things that we're having to do at the county level and the city level. So I think that's our biggest disappointment. But we would continue to also try and find, and I don't know about Colorado, a local ability to generate resources locally, to whether it's an excise tax. We heard about property tax. The retail tax is where a lot of those revenues are at, and so those jurisdictions and those counties where particularly the processing and production is going at, they're not generating revenue, and that's a problem.
And just to keep it in perspective, I think when you take general fund, bond revenues, special funds, our budget's about $175 billion, so maybe even more of an issue. All right, we're getting close to wrapping this up, so let me just ask to summarize. This is sort of a broad question, but I think it might be useful to the audience. What would you point to as the biggest lesson, if you had to point to something that was learned during this process?
So I love the point, and I'll forget the man's name at the beginning, that there is actually something very exciting about this, that government's rarely asked to do something totally new, and citizens rarely get a chance to watch government do something and participate, first of all, but also appreciate new things being done. And so there was this point where Coloradans, whether they were for or against marijuana, they were proud of the work put in the first 3 years. Did it last forever? No, but it was an interesting moment to watch, that there's a bit of civic engagement here that really matters. And so I would say don't ignore that power. And I think there's two big ways to do that. First is never stop having listening sessions. Never stop having ways in which your average citizen can come up and talk directly to power on this and say, here's my issue, here's what I'm seeing, please help. The more and more you can put that into perspective for them, the more you can educate them, the more they can educate you back. And so it's more than just an open door policy. We started with the Amendment 64 Task Force, which was hundreds of meetings. I know a few counties here have done opening listening sessions. Every time we've had an issue from then on, edibles, pesticides, we have we've had listening sessions again where everyone's allowed to come and everyone's allowed to speak. The other side of that coin is you got to make sure you have good data. If you're going to do that, you have to make sure that you are presenting data that is agnostic and is as straightforward as possible all of the time. There are a lot of data streams I wish we had gotten right at the beginning, so we would have had better baseline data, but we take data very seriously for marijuana on all things public health, public safety, and economic related. And so, governing at the seat of it is not that hard. It's putting forth good data, listening to the people, having smart people in the room making educated guesses, and then reiterating that process over and over and over again. For marijuana, you get to do that, and there's kind of a sweet spot at the beginning where everybody's going to come and do it with you. And so I would say enjoy that moment and use that moment the best you can.
So our lesson learned actually is more about something that we oftentimes don't care much for, and that is the citizens' initiative process. Our statute came to us through the citizens' initiative process. It's a legislature that failed to act politically, and the citizens really, 56 to 44 is a pretty large vote, acted in a way that perhaps didn't produce the very best piece of legislation. And so I think what we would have preferred to see is a legislature that would have been more thoughtful in what recreational marijuana legalization would have looked like, from revenue sharing to authorities to the harmonization of state and local government responsibilities. There would have been a more thoughtful system. We had to 2 years later integrate the medical system because the recreational system was passed via citizens initiative that conflicted with the medical system. And so it's just a good reminder that direct democracy can be more ugly than what we think is a cumbersome legislative process. And so it's just another example that our political leaders at the state capitol are oftentimes less willing to act than the citizens themselves are through the direct democracy and the citizens initiative. And so the one thing we learned as an association is that when we start to see these citizens initiative ideas getting formed, is to go and talk to those folks, regardless of what the issue is, to say, how's this going to impact county government? How's this, can we help you? Can we help you think through this process? So it's independent of the marijuana lesson. It was actually a lesson to us to start to talk to folks that are forming these citizens initiatives that might have a direct impact onto county government in general.
All right, well, great food for thought, and thank you very much, Eric Johnson and Andrew Freedman, for showing up today. Thank you all.